The Revenge of the Wizard's Ghost by John Bellairs, Chapter 6. The next morning, when he woke up, Professor Childermass could hardly believe that he had had that strange telephone conversation with his old friend. Now that his head was clear, he wondered if he really ought to go off on this wild-goose chase. Could the Urim and the Thummim really be at that old estate? It seemed unlikely, but on the other hand, the thing that had happened to Johnny was pretty unlikely, and how else could he be saved? The doctors at the hospital couldn't drive the spirit of Warren Windrow out of Johnny's body. A long shot was better than no shot at all, so the professor made his mind up. He would go. For days he planned. He ransacked his basement for tools. He dug an old leather satchel out of his attic. He drove up to Durham and got a guidebook and a map from Professor Coote. These had been issued by the foundation that was fixing up the Windrow estate. The next evening the professor called up Fergie and asked him to come over to his house. No, he wouldn't say over the phone what he wanted him for, but he claimed that it was very important. It was about a plan he had to save Johnny's life. When Fergie arrived at the professor's house, the old man marched into the living room, gave him a piece of chocolate cake and a fork, and started telling him his plan. He explained about the Urim and the Thummim, Ensign French, the tomb with the weird inscription, and old Zebulon. Fergie sat listening in open-mouthed amazement. He even forgot to eat his cake. "And so, that's what I think we ought to do," said the professor, finishing up. "I want you to come along and help me. I need someone who's gutsy and resourceful. I need someone who won't cave in when the going gets rough, and that's you, my friend. You know what's happened to Johnny, and you also know that there's very little chance of saving him unless we fight magic with magic. Will you go with me to find the Urim and the Thummim?" Fergie put his uneaten cake down on the coffee table and pondered. There was a doubtful frown on his face. He had seen Johnny's twisted face. He had seen and heard a lot of strange things in the last few months, but he was a skeptical kid, and he didn't really want to believe that an evil spirit had taken possession of Johnny's body. There might be some other explanation, a scientific one. I don't know, Professor," said Fergie slowly. "All this stuff about amulets and devils sounds kind of nutty to me. Maybe Johnny really does have a brain sickness like the doctors say." The professor was beginning to get exasperated. "Oh, brain sickness, your grandmother," he growled. "You told me that he saw a box of matches in the ice cream parlor and called them Loco Focos. Well, I looked up that weird little phrase, and it's what they called matches back in the 1830s. How the dickens would Johnny have known about that, unless he was possessed by the spirit of somebody who was alive in the 1830s? "He might have looked it up, same as you did," said Fergie calmly. The professor ground his teeth and glared at Fergie. Then, without a word, he walked over to the sideboard and jerked a drawer open. After fumbling a bit, he pulled out a paper-wrapped parcel and a magnifying glass. With a snort, he dashed back to the coffee table and laid these things down in front of Fergie. As Fergie stared with a puzzled expression, he unwrapped the parcel and laid the magnifying glass down next to it. "All right," said the professor fiercely. "You want to be logical? Let's be logical. There are the glass photograph and the gold coin. You've seen them before, I know. But I have a few things to tell you that might surprise you. Pick up the magnifying glass and have a look at the buttons on the coat that man in the photograph is wearing. Have a good look." Fergie took the magnifying glass in his hand and peered. His eyes opened wide, and he leaned a little closer and peered some more. "The buttons say WW," he said, "so it must be a picture of—" "Warren Windrow," snapped the professor, cutting him off. "Of course, it could be a photo of a young man named Woodrow Wallace or Walter Wintergreen, but I don't think that's terribly likely. All right, let's talk about the gold coin. I looked it up, and it was minted by somebody named J.S. Ormsby in Sacramento, California in the year 1849. And that coin is so rare, there is only one of them around. How in blue blazes did Johnny get his hands on one? And why was he keeping it in his bureau drawer along with a photo that is 100 years old? Can you come up with any logical explanations?" Fergie shook his head. "All right, then," the professor said, stabbing his finger at Fergie. "Will you come and help me before it's too late?" Fergie turned pale, and he nodded in a low voice. He said that he would do what he could to save Johnny. The next day, Professor Childermass called up Fergie's mother and did some fast talking. He told her that he wanted to take Fergie on a short trip to the Hudson Valley River to see Washington Irving's home and other places of interest. To make the trip sound reasonable, he said that it would help Fergie in his schoolwork, and he added that Fergie needed to get away from Dunstan Heights for a while so that he would stop thinking about Johnny and his tragic illness. Fergie would have to be ready to go early Friday morning, so of course he'd have to be excused from school for that day. Was this possible? At first, Mrs. Ferguson resisted, but the professor could be very charming and persuasive when he wanted to be, and at last she gave in. She would get her son excused, and she hoped that he would have a wonderful time. On the very next Friday morning at 10:15, Fergie was sitting at the kitchen table in his home waiting for the phone to ring. He was wearing his motorcycle outfit, skin-tight blue jeans, black ankle-high boots, and a black leather jacket covered with chrome-plated studs and red glass reflectors. Near him, on the warm linoleum, stood his suitcase. It was old and beat up and had dirty red plaid sides and a zipper. Into it he had stuffed everything he thought he would need, including a large red portable searchlight and a small crowbar that he had swiped from his dad's tool chest in the basement. His dad wouldn't miss the crowbar right away if he was off on one of his weekend selling trips. Mr. Ferguson sold encyclopedias, Bibles, and mail-order shoes, and he didn't make a lot of money. But he worked like a beaver driving around the countryside in his old blue Ford, trying to drum up more business. Fergie worried about his dad. He was afraid that he was working too hard. Fergie thought about the Urim and the Thummim, the magical do-jiggers that he and the professor were going after. After they saved Johnny from the evil spirit, perhaps they could sell the amulets to a museum for a lot of money. He hoped so. Fergie winced. He felt guilty to be thinking about money at a time like this, with Johnny lying sick in bed. But when he looked around at the shabby furnishings of the living room, he thought about how nice it would be to come waltzing in the door and throw a big bundle of $100 bills on the table. It wouldn't be just nice, it would be like heaven. "Fergie, wasn't the professor going to call you a half hour ago? What do you suppose he's doing?" This was Mrs. Ferguson calling through the open kitchen doorway. She was a worn-looking, mild little woman with stringy gray hair. She had been doing the dishes and had been having some second thoughts about this trip that her son was taking. She knew the professor, and she trusted him in spite of his being nervous, irritable, and a bit on the eccentric side. Still, she wouldn't have been terribly surprised to have him phone and call the trip off. She would even have been a bit relieved if that had happened. "I don't know why he hasn't called, Mom," said Fergie, answering his mother's question. "He told me to be ready at 10:15, and he said he'd give me a buzz before he came over. He's usually so darn persnickety about stuff like that." The phone rang. In an instant, Fergie was on his feet. He ran to the sideboard and ripped the receiver from the cradle. It was the professor. In his usual raspy voice, he apologized for being late and said that he'd be over in 10 minutes. Fergie hung up and heaved a big sigh of relief. He had been kind of uncertain about this trip at first, but now he was all worked up and ready to go. Exactly 10 minutes later, Professor Childermass pulled up in front of the Fergusons' house in his mud-spattered maroon Pontiac. Fergie was waiting on the porch with his suitcase in his hand. His mother was right beside him, and now she gave him a big smooch on the cheek. Fergie winced. It always embarrassed him when his mother kissed him in public. "Have a good time," she called as he took off, running down the walk. "Did you remember to pack your baby brownie, Cam?"